In the lead up to this year's general election, several artists, including Mark Wallinger, Jeremy Deller and Richard Wentworth, agreed to make posters for the Labour Party as part of the Make a Mark project. Now with the election only days away, I spoke to three artists, Vicky Wright, Shazad Dawood and Liam Gillick, about their very different approaches to this project.
Yeah. I guess it's very hard for me to separate, the design of the poster I came up with from my whole kind of interaction with the project, which was always a bit dubious from the outset. Particularly, I was approached initially to make a poster to keep the Tories out, which I can, comply with wholesale, no problems with that. I think the Tories, it's amazing we still have a Tory party, given what they stand for is totally anachronistic and kind of suicidal, even on their own terms, even economically, let alone culturally, and in terms of the, continued evolution of this country in all sorts of ways to be productive and successful. And so that's also where the design for the poster came up. The evolution of consciousness moves forward, not backward. You can't go backwards. Some idea of some sort of little Middle England, and I remember I was on some panel recently with a Tory MP about culture and the arts in Britain, and he was suggesting that, we should go back to sort of traditional values like Constable and Gainsborough, and it was just like, you're an idiot. Given the kind of richness of cultural life, I love Constable and Gainsborough, but given the richness of a much more expanded broadening of not just visual arts, but dance, theatre, to a kind of global internationalism in which Britain has led the way in the last 10 years through kind of opening up and through the actions of certain, visionary individuals, which has attracted a hell of a lot of international capital, international visitors, tourism, audiences to Britain. His whole thinking was so kind of, what's the word, sort of microscopically mundane and unintelligent. It just, brought home that, if the Tories get in here, we're really in trouble, morally, ethically, philosophically, but even spiritually and holistically. And that was really where my poster design came from. The fact that I was then asked to actually do it sort of pro the Labour Party and with a possible auction of the poster to benefit the Labour Party, well, I'm very much one of a generation who were very, very disappointed and heartbroken, having, celebrated to the core of my being Labour getting in all those years ago, and then, proportional representation, which is sort of back on the cards, being one of the very first election promises that Tony Blair broke, let alone the much, much greater and deeper ones of going to war along with a Republican president, and many, many other sort of things which are deep, deep ethical, minefields. The last thing I wanted to do was to benefit the Labour Party. I think, yes, I'd rather have them stay in than the Tories, because the Tories is that but worse. But I really think, and I'm a great believer in proportional representation, all this fear about a hung parliament causing damage to Britain's economy. But one can't just think economically, and especially short-term economically. I think there's a longer-term case to be made for a hung parliament resulting in a proportional government that's more reflective of the British people and of the voting public, and is therefore ultimately more democratic. And ultimately that can't but have a benefit culturally, economically, and otherwise in a slightly longer-term phase. It puts Britain again ahead of the curve in terms of its public, its relationship to government, its relationship to culture, and its broadening, and its ability to be self-reflexive. I think that's what puts Britain ahead of a lot of countries in Europe, that it's been able to be self-critical, that it's been able to take itself to task, and it's almost like the Tories want to backtrack from that to an idea of, a neo-imperialist, fascist kind of agenda, which isn't far from Mosley's. The fact that the Bolton riots only, a month or so ago, with the English Defence League, but it wasn't long ago that in the Tory manifesto they wanted to have an English Defence League as a sort of anti-terrorist measure, and as soon as you're using language like that, you can see coded into the structures of Tory language as either a total ignorance of history or a kind of tacit will to fascism. And you can see that in the sort of lack of substance in whenever you hear a Tory MP speak on TV. I just think, well, listen with your heart, and there's nothing there except perhaps the possibility of something to be afraid of, and it really is nothing to be afraid of because it's meaningless, but it could be something to be afraid of if it's given energy and support by the voting public. So that's the basic substance of my poster. I think, you know, it's not reasonable or adult at this stage to sort of, you know, if you look at most of the campaign posters going, oh, another few years of Gordon Brown, or another, you know, or showing David Cameron with a Vauxhall Astra or whatever, you know, all these things that have caused a big hoo-ha. Can we stop this sort of short-term, very superficial bickering and really look a bit deeper? You know, I mean, it's so childish, a lot of the politicking, not just in this country, I mean, you see it everywhere, but that was also the design for my poster, something very simple and abstract and geometric, hopefully appealing to people's higher mind, which I think we're really in dire need of as a global population these days, but certainly in this country with an election coming up.
I'm not really sure that the posters have a positive message, but they certainly are an attempt to go back to a set of ideas that maybe has been lost and spun out of control. I do think it's worth reminding both myself and maybe other people about the basic ideas behind the party, and not just merely creating a kind of postmodern, ironic perspective. I also think that the idea of a kind of anti-conservative message is really an appropriation of a Saatchi strategy that was used originally and pioneered by the Conservative Party itself. And I think it's better to look at other ways of thinking about how to represent a party. In a way, maybe these posters are not for this election, they're for another election at another time. They're a way of trying to recharge a set of ideas, or a way of thinking about something, and a way of picturing it, and moving away from this kind of very typical Labour Party way of talking about how people should try to begin to understand that the message is this, and actually speak a bit more directly.
I wanted to attack the idea of privilege with my idea for the piece. The notion that we still have a society where large swathes of people are excluded from aspiration and work and having, you know, the opportunities to develop themselves as, you know, human beings and as potentially a workforce and things like this. And I think that it's a problem in Westminster, but it's also a legacy of the class system which still hasn't gone, unfortunately. And you only have to sort of visit the north of England to realise just how marginalised sections of people are. It's a very difficult issue, but I do think that Labour have addressed it with their policies, things like the Sure Start scheme, trying to, you know, capture the imaginations of children when they're young, to develop them into being healthy people, rather than become, you know, feral and this sort of thing. So there's kind of a very practical agenda, I think, from Labour on that side of things. But just going back to the idea of privilege, you know, it's the sort of, there are statistics that show that the majority of professional jobs go to the children of professionals, things like this. So I think any kind of party that wants to take state funding out of, you know, comprehensive schools and start pushing the money towards people that have got the wherewithal to get on anyway, this has got to be dubious, you know. So it's kind of education is very much on my mind, about the opportunities that have been lent to, you know, sort of more recent generations to have a degree education, which is fairly recent for anybody but the middle classes. You know, I mean, I don't want to go into my family history, but there's a whole history there of getting education rights for the working class. So, you know, I'm very proud of that, and I think that's something that we need to aim for more. So the poster says, haven't eaten, which is a pun on Eton, the school, where the majority of Tory politicians seem to have spent their time. And it's not that I'm against ideas of intellectual elitism, it's more that I want things to be more inclusive, and I see that, you know, under a Tory government they're going to just take away money from the public sector, so those were my reasons to do it.
I suppose for me it was a vision of what I would like to see political posters looking like. You know, that they actually appeal to something higher and more noble and cause us to reflect on the true underlying structure rather than falling into the superficial debates and bickering, which, you know, we can all get sidetracked in. But what if we were to suspend our own little selfish, petty-minded, you know, big-glamoured reactions to things for just a moment for something as serious as the leadership and direction of this country, and try and look to a kind of greater good and a kind of evolution of things. Because with a step back you can actually start to see how all these structures work, and I don't think we do that enough. So I was really hoping, and maybe it's largely optimistic and, you know, maybe my poster falls short of it, but it still seemed worth a try, to actually, you know, have something that might appeal to people's higher mind, like I've said, that might make people stop and think, oh, this isn't like other political posters. Is it a political poster? What is this saying? What is it advertising? You know, that space, which is often so uncritically looked at, the space of advertising, of media, of mediation, actually causes a kind of dialogue with its audience. In that way, it's actually looking to connect with its audience and to elicit a response and you know, a level of thought and consideration from them, you know, which is probably the antithesis of the whole media industry. But perhaps again, Britain could lead the way, as it has done in advertising for a number of years, by actually shifting up a gear.
You know, the idea of Renew Labour is really an attempt to sort of reinvent something, or to encourage an atmosphere of reinvention. The notion of New Labour is so associated with the Blair period that it's frankly not a kind of term that should be used anymore. So it's really a plea to people to start to rethink how the party is imagined and thought about. The other issue is that you know, right now the possibility of Conservative government has somehow been able to be viewed as an inevitability, and people have really short memories about how destructive and how pernicious and how tricky and antisocial and all the rest of it the Conservative Party really can be. And that's why I wanted my images not but the only way to kind of get around this is to actually reimagine and reposition the Labour Party, and that's the basis of my posters. They've been done from the perspective of being a citizen rather than an artist, and they're done with a kind of heavy heart in a way, but one that that hopes and imagines that there can be a way to avoid an alternative that I think that people have sort of forgotten about.